Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today, Interpreting in Domestic Violence Settings Part 2. Thank you very much again for attending. If you were here for Part 1 as well, thank you for that too. Now we have again Olga Garcia Caro, and she will be delivering Part 2 of Interpreting in Domestic Violence Settings. I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, as always, you're going to have some handouts in the GoToWebinar app. As always, I like to put the Ausit Code of Ethics in there, just in case you don't have a copy already. And then I also have 4 other handouts there relating to this webinar. We have the references as handout 1. So everything that Olga speaks about today, you will find a list of references and you can actually access all those resources that she'll be talking about today. And then you'll find another couple of handouts there, which are the power and control wheel, as well as the using children wheel. And finally, Olga's going to be finishing today with some homework for you, and you'll find some case scenarios that are in particular to domestic violence interpreting, so you can download all those. You can also access the recording of this webinar. You'll receive a link tomorrow if you, for whatever reason, weren't able to attend today or you want to keep it for future reference. You'll have access to the recording of this webinar, of course. And we will also be emailing you the PDFs of Interpreting in Domestic Violence Settings Part 2. So the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation that Olga will be using today, you can also access that with an email tomorrow. I also wanted to mention, had a lot of people asking about how do we claim this on the NAATI PD catalog. Now, all our webinars or webinars in general, they can be actually claimed from a few different categories. So we don't really want to pinpoint just the one category. So if you would like, you can access the NAATI PD catalog from their website, but we'll also email you one of those two with your PDFs that will be emailed out. So like we said, they can be, each webinar can be actually claimed from multiple, sometimes multiple categories. For example, there'll be points that will be covering ethics today, as well as contextual knowledge, which means that it already covers at least 2 categories there. So please access the PD catalog. If you can't, or if you haven't for whatever reason, we'll be emailing you one out as well. Also, I just wanted to announce a small trigger warning as well. Now, the content, you might find some, there may be some potentially distressing content in the webinar as well. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of a trigger warning. Without further ado, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Olga Garcia Caro, who has been doing research on interpreting in domestic violence settings and who is currently completing her PhD at the University of RMIT. Olga, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fatih, for your introduction and also for inviting me to deliver this second webinar on interpreting in domestic and family violence settings. We're just going to go and start. Now, tonight, we're going to talk a bit more about domestic violence, and we'll be exploring further the nature of it. And then we're going to talk about how to prepare for domestic violence assignments, and we'll see a few examples of discourse considerations for interpreters in particular settings. Okay, and lastly, we have an activity where I invite you to reflect on a number of scenarios and with a bit of a guide to reflect also on any of other jobs that you might be doing or challenges that you might come across. So let's go ahead and start.
Just one moment before
Yes.
you start there, Olga. Sorry, I also forgot to mention that this is going to be an interactive webinar. So please, as you have questions, you can ask them. If you have comments, questions, please put them through, and I will do my best to ask all questions and direct them to Olga, but please do understand we have a limited time. I will do my best to answer all the questions, but whatever we can't answer, we will, as always, get back to you within the next week or two by compiling all your questions into an FAQ format and emailing all the answers out to you as well. I apologize, Olga, please go ahead.
No, that's right, Fatih. We'll try and answer them as we go. And if your question is not answered, then, as Fatih said, we'll compile frequent asked questions for you and then send them through. That's for sure. Now, we're going to start then with a review of domestic violence. And as I said, exploring it a bit deeper and then narrowing it down to at-risk groups such as culturally and linguistically diverse women, and how we fit as interpreters in this scenario, in this setting. Okay, well, the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children in Australia, and this plan covers from the year 2012 to 2022, defines domestic violence as acts of violence that occur between people who have or have had an intimate relationship. Now, while there is no single definition, the central element of domestic violence is an ongoing pattern of behavior aimed at controlling a partner through fear. For example, by using behavior which is violent and which is threatening. In most cases, the violent behavior is part of a range of tactics to exercise power and control over women and their children, and it can be both criminal and non-criminal. Now, this behavior can take many forms. We wouldn't be able to describe or to cite all the types of behavior and all the forms, but some of them are physical violence, controlling who you see or what you do, emotional abuse, including insults, manipulation, threats, naming, financial abuse, such as controlling your access to money, stalking and other kinds of harassment, sexual violence, of course, including coercion and any other forms of behavior that are used to control you, to make you afraid, or to diminish your sense of self-worth. Now, the National Plan also says that domestic violence can happen to anyone. However, men are the majority of perpetrators and women and children are the majority of victims and survivors. We also know that violence is never acceptable, so the perpetrator is always solely responsible for the violent situation. And we have to have in mind that using a language or framing the story in a way that suggests the survivor of violence was in any way to blame for what happened should always be avoided. So we're talking about language here, and remember that language is a social product. In other words, it's a product of society, yes? And we use language to do things in the real world, such as framing a conversation, yes? So avoiding language that suggests that the victim is responsible in any way, or using language that justifies the behavior of perpetrators, all this should be avoided, okay? We are experts of language, and so we have to be aware of the way we use language. Now, the National Plan acknowledges that domestic violence is not just a one-off incident, okay? It occurs in a broader context in which power and resources are distributed unequally between genders, and in a context in which women are much more likely to be victims of violence than men. Okay, in regards to terminology, we also know that there are a range of terms, and we know that some of them exclude, some of them include, and many of them are used interchangeably. Here in Australia, the most common ones that you may come across, including domestic violence, which is the term that I am using in this presentation, are, for example, intimate partner violence. And intimate partner violence is used to refer to kinds of violence, such as physical, sexual, psychological, and so on, that occur in the context of an intimate, a close or romantic, it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual relationship. It can be in marriage, it can be a de facto partnership, or other kinds of less formal relationships, for example, boyfriend, girlfriend, and relationships of those sorts. Now, family violence is a broader term, as we saw in webinar part 1, which is used to acknowledge violence that happens within a broader network of family and community members. For example, violence that occurs with extended kinship and family relationships in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. In fact, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner defines family violence as any use of force, be it physical or non-physical, which is aimed at controlling another family member or community member and which undermines the person's well-being. Now, sometimes we also know that the violence is not just perpetrated by the partner or the person in that romantic relationship, but also by extended family, for example, the in-laws. So this term, family violence, is a kind of a broader one that includes those types of violence. And we also have, and you might come across quite a bit, violence against women. And violence against women is any act of gender-based violence that is likely to lead to harm or suffering to women, whether it happens in public or behind closed doors. Now, the term gender-based means that the violence disproportionately affects women more than men on the whole, that it occurs in a broader social context, as we just mentioned, where power and resources are distributed unequally between men and women, and that the violence is a way of reinforcing that gendered power imbalance. Okay, in other words, it is a tool to maintain that power. And one thing that we have to have in mind in relation to terminology is that we always use appropriate terms, okay? So using language such as, or terms such as it was a domestic dispute or volatile relationships, that just minimizes and trivializes a violent situation. So again, as a language experts, being aware of the language that we use. Okay, and being aware of how we make use of language and also its discourse implications. Okay.
Just a question there, Olga.
Yes.
Would violence against minors be classified under family violence or another specific terminology, violence against minors or children?
Violence against minors, I think it would, as we are talking about terminology, how all terms include and exclude, it might be appropriate to use family violence. However, the truth is that if we have a look at what the legislation says, and when they talk about domestic and family violence, any children who are present in violent situations, even if the violence is not directly towards children, for example, they are witness or they hear the violence occurring in the home, they are considered as to be victims of violence. So it depends on what type of violence it is, I guess.
But yeah, if you have a look at like a family violence order or an intervention order, that does cover children as well as affected
Yes.
family members. So I guess it could be covered under family violence as well, even if they are just witnessing it, even if they're not there, even if they're hearing it, it covers them too.
Yes, exactly right, and they can be also protected by that intervention order. That's for sure. But for domestic violence, even if we don't use the term family violence, even using domestic violence, if children are involved, if children are there, then they do fall also under that term. Yeah. Okay, continue. But yes, terminology is always a bit of a tricky one because they are used interchangeably, but some of them, depending on the context, some of them are more appropriate to use in one context or in another, that's for sure. Okay, we also talked about the impacts of domestic violence. And the impacts of domestic violence are varied. They are profound and can be long-lasting, and we'll see that in a minute. Survivors may continue to need support many years after the violence has finished or after they have escaped violence, and also has a range of consequences for families and communities and ultimately for society as a whole. Here we only have an example of some of the consequences. It would be impossible to name them all here and tonight, but there are other effects such as, let's say, affecting children's ability to learn at school. So that could be one of the effects, okay? Now, some of the effects in relation to health are that domestic violence has been identified as the leading contributor to death amongst women aged 15 to 44 in Victoria. But also, victims are at greater risk of suffering high blood pressure, smoking, obesity, and other disorders and conditions. It can also leave survivors with serious physical injuries and can lead to mental health problems and intellectual disabilities, including acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury. And violence against women can also lead to miscarriage, to bleeding, infections, abdominal trauma, and death, as we know. And there is evidence that there are both short and long-term impacts, including disability, of course, for unborn children as well, where mothers experience violence during their pregnancy. And it includes fetal death, fetal fractures, low birth weight, and injury. Also, acts of sexual violence can also occur within intimate relationships. Okay, so sexual violence can cause pain, injury, and a whole range of health conditions, such as infections, fertility problems, unwanted pregnancies, and miscarriage as well. In relation to mental health, there are many studies which show that domestic violence has serious impacts on survivors' mental health. It can lead to depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and other stress and trauma-related syndromes. In Australia only, it is estimated that around almost 20% of all depression experienced by women and around 18% of all anxiety disorders experienced by women are associated with domestic and family violence. And also children who are exposed, as we just mentioned before, exposed to domestic violence are also more likely to experience these impacts. Survivors are also more likely to have problems with alcohol, with smoking, and using non-prescription drugs. And women who have experienced domestic violence are at much greater risk of attempting suicide than women who haven't. Of course, we've got economic impacts. Domestic violence is a huge economic burden for the nation. I think we talked about billions of dollars in our first webinar. It includes costs associated with homelessness and loss of employment and healthcare, of course. For example, in relation to homelessness, 1 in 3 people accessing specialist homelessness services indicate domestic violence as a reason for needing assistance. In fact, it's the most common reason given. And the majority of these people are women, around 63-65%, and children around 20%. Also, 42% of women approaching homelessness services report that domestic violence is the reason that they are seeking help. And what's more, nearly 90% of people using homelessness services report that they grew up with conflict in the home. Again, linking it back to children. So this suggests that childhood exposure to domestic violence is a major risk factor for homelessness later in life. So we're talking here about data and figures, but the problem of data is that domestic violence is vastly underreported. It's a vastly underreported crime. So of women who have experienced violence from a current partner, 39%, 40% had never sought advice or support, and 80% had never contacted the police. And because most people who experience domestic violence do not report it to police, recorded crime statistics cannot really tell us exactly how many people live with it in Australia. And as we discussed last week, we have very little data and information about CALD women, so culturally and linguistically diverse women.
Sorry, Olga, just questions
Yes.
come through from a practitioner. Is there any domestic violence against men at all?
Well, domestic violence, as per the legislation, and we just saw before the plan, the national plan states that it can happen to anyone. However, the vast majority of victims are women, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men. So, and we also talked about about the gendered underpinning of the problem. So it's more about it's situated in the broader context and the power imbalances of gender. So it's a different conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Olga.
So we've got here an example of health effects, okay, of domestic violence. Now, the World Health Organization tells us that the relationship between exposures to violence and health effects is quite complex, as you can very well see here. Please don't worry too much if it's not, the image is not very clear, because you've got, as Fatih said, you've got the link to this information. So there are multiple pathways through which domestic violence can lead to adverse health outcomes, as we see here. The figure here highlights 3 key mechanisms and pathways that can explain many of these outcomes. So we've got physical trauma, psychological trauma and stress, and fear and control. And many of them can lead to both disability or death. Okay. So we might be, let's say, interpreting at a chronic pain clinic or at a continence clinic appointment where we expect to do health and medical interpreting, but at the same time, it may be that we come across disclosures of violence or discussions of violence which explain the medical conditions. Because if you see here, some of the consequences or the effects might come in the form of irritable bowel syndrome or chronic pain or chronic pelvic pain. Okay, all right, so we can see here how complex it is. And I'll leave this for you to have a better look. So the effects of domestic violence are deep and are vast. All right, we also talked last time about the intersectorial nature of domestic violence and how women's experiences of violence are as diverse as their own status. So understanding women in relation not only to their experiences of gender inequality, but also the social divisions of class, race, age, disability, and so on. So what this means is that what domestic violence looks like for us or for one person in particular may be different to what other people may know about it or the experiences of others. Okay, so for example, women whose immigration status is vulnerable, for example, women who are on a partner visa or a student visa, may perhaps have different experiences of violence than women who are citizens and are eligible for services and support and welfare payments, okay, that may help her get onto a safety plan. Okay, it is important that we are aware of this because when we enter a communicative event, in other words, an assignment, an appointment, we do it with all ourself. Okay, this means that we do it with all our experiences, with all our beliefs and knowledge about the world. And just because our AUSIT Code of Ethics states that interpreters observe impartiality at all times, that just doesn't make us automatically impartial, does it? We have to do something about it so that we are impartial. So the first step towards observing impartiality is just being aware of our own attitudes, our beliefs, our experiences, and the knowledge that we have, okay, in this particular setting, the knowledge that we have in relation to domestic violence. Okay, as we know, domestic violence can happen to anyone. However, some people are more at risk than others, and it can be harder for people who are marginalized in some way to get help. Some of the at-risk groups include women with disabilities, pregnant women, women who live in regional, let's say regional Victoria, regional areas, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and of course, migrant and refugee women. And in particular, women from culturally and linguistically diverse communities can face significant difficulties, as we know, including lack of support networks, language barriers, socioeconomic disadvantage, and lack of knowledge of their rights and of Australian laws. Okay. We talked about how CALD women experience a range of barriers. Remember, one of them is a language. And when these women access services, then that's when us as interpreters come into the picture. Okay, and as our role as interpreters and as part of government services is to assist women access justice and other services responding to domestic violence. And how do we do this? Well, by providing quality interpreting services. So not only having good language and transfer skills, but being accurate by providing complete renditions, complete interpretations, by actively observing confidentiality and impartiality. So not just by saying, oh, it says so on a piece of paper, on a document, on an AUSIT document, but actively observing by having a deep knowledge of discourse in the setting that we are interpreting in. In other words, what types of questions do police, lawyers, social workers, counsellors ask in their settings? And what is more important, how do they ask them and why? Okay. Also, by knowing about the documents that they use in their work and how do the different systems operate in each setting. Okay. All this is going to help us provide quality interpreting. In the same way, we also assist women in accessing justice and other services by knowing the aims of these professionals responding to domestic violence and by having a deep understanding of what domestic violence is. Okay, so yes, we are key role players. Okay, Fati, do we have any comments or questions?
Yep, I've got one from
on?
an interpreter. What are the factors of domestic violence and what could be the solutions? I think it's a pretty big question.
Oh, that is a pretty big question. Yes, it's very big, and it's. I don't think it's up to me to respond to that
Well,
because
maybe it might be worth mentioning. Sorry,
yes?
Olga. I'll wait for you.
No, go ahead. No,
Maybe
go
it might
ahead.
be worth mentioning the Royal Commission and its findings. There's plenty there to talk about.
Yes, and also the Royal Commission has not only, of course, there's pages and pages, thousands of pages. You don't have to read the whole thing. They've got a summary version, and that might be a good way to start. But the solutions, well, given that it is a gender-based issue in the broader context of society, then perhaps that would be a start. I guess that would be a start. Yes, sorry, we it's completely out of the scope of our session. That would be quite a big discussion. That's for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Olga. But like we said, you can go onto the website for the Family Violence Royal Commission that was done by the Victorian state, the state of Victoria, and it has a very good website where you can read the summaries, you can punch in keywords, and it'll bring out exactly what you're after. It's a very valuable website, and I believe we also have it on the resources as well, and we'll make sure if it's not there, it'll be in the email that's sent out. It's definitely a resource that's well worth spending a little bit of time on.
Yes, exactly right, Fati. It's a great starting point, and as I said, you don't have to access the whole thing because it's got quite a few volumes. But there is a summary, and I think it's a great resource, great resource to start with. That's for sure. Okay, we're going to start with our. I'm just being mindful of the time. Going to start with our second part of our session tonight, and this is how to prepare for domestic violence assignments. In fact, it's going to help you prepare for any assignment. You can transpose it to any assignment, but what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the tools that we have to prepare for assignments and to talk about the discourse considerations for us interpreters. Okay. All right, in webinar part 1, I did ask you to have a think about the different settings where domestic violence might be discussed. We had a quick look at the expected settings such as police, the courts, domestic violence organizations, hospitals, and so on. So these are response services. But there are other settings and services where they either screen for domestic violence, such as at a pregnancy appointments, or later with the maternal and child health nurse. Or it might be that disclosures of violence just happen, such as at allied health or Centrelink appointments. Okay. Now, we can't go through all the possible scenarios and settings, can we? Because we know that domestic violence, there are a whole range of services, and domestic violence has an impact on a range of things. So it would be impossible to talk about all of them, but we can make use of one of the basic skills that interpreters need to have, and that is preparing for assignments. And we can use a guide such as this one here to help us in doing this. As we know, interpreting is not just about knowing the language and having high bilingual skills or high bicultural skills. It is a whole range of different skills. It's a set of skills that that bilinguals don't have. Yes, one of them is how to prepare for assignments. That's just a must. Okay, so we've got here a bit of a guide to help us, and you might use these questions in order to prepare, and that would be, what is the overall purpose of this service? So what is it that they do in this service? What is their underpinning philosophy? So knowing the scopus, in other words, knowing the overall purpose of the service is a starting point. That's the first thing. Another thing is, what is the aim of the interaction? So what is the aim of the appointment? What is the aim of the communicative event? And what type of questions do these professionals in this service ask? Okay, what are the types of questions? But also, most importantly, how do they ask these questions? Yes, and this is where discourse implications for us come into action. So how do they ask these questions? This is very important. Do they do small talk at the beginning of the session? And what might be the purpose of this? Why would they do small talk and not get straight into it? How do they build rapport with the client, and why do they build rapport with the client? All right. What are the processes of this service in particular? So how does the system work? What do they do first? What do they do then? Do they issue referrals? Do they send clients then to a different service? Do they work with other services? Okay, what might the journey look like for this client or for clients of this service? For example, understanding the process of how to apply for an intervention order. And this is quite simple, a simple thing to do, to search. You know, it's just at our fingertips. You just go onto the court's website and you can read and see what is an intervention order, how do we apply for it. Before the lockdown, the courts had, they usually have tours for people who want to know more about the court system. So you can, there was one of them called Walking in Her Shoes, I think it was, where you could make a booking for a tour, and they would take you through the journey of applying for an intervention order. So things like that. Now, really, it's all at our fingertips on the internet. So knowing about the process of the things that they do in this service. Also, what type of texts and documents and material do they use? So remember that you might be interpreting questions that a professional might be asking to fill in a form, okay? But you also might be sight translating some of the documents, okay, or some of the material. So if you come across a new document, new material, or forms that you might be unfamiliar with, just ask the professional for a copy or ask where can you access one. Okay, is there a website where you can access it? Yeah, you can do this, you know, after the session has finished in a post briefing. You might be able to do that. Or if they are giving out, sometimes you know how they give out a copy to the client, you can ask for one, and that's okay. If you are unfamiliar with it, it's a good way for you to prepare for next time, okay? Also, what's the terminology? Of course, we need to know the terminology, but remember that terminology is the easy part of interpreting. We just have to look it up and learn it, yes? It's the other skills that we need to work with time and with practice. So, for example, if a term doesn't exist in the target language, then we need to know how to resolve this lack of equivalence, don't we? Yes. So if I use the strategy of paraphrasing, in other words, using different words to transfer the meaning of that term, I would need to know first what it means in the source language. Yes, we would need to know, what is this term? What does it mean? What does it do in the real world, in that setting, in order for us to apply the basic theoretical strategies that that we have available for interpreting. Okay, that's one of the most common ones. For instance, let's say for the sake of an example, that we don't have an equivalent in the target language for intervention order, okay? Because let's say intervention orders don't exist in the target language country, or they might exist but are different, okay? So we would need to know what they are and how they function in the real world here in order to paraphrase and get the meaning across. Okay, so so this is very important. So as you know, paraphrasing is one of the most common strategies used for when we come across equivalence issues and lack of equivalence in translating and interpreting. But of course, we need to know more about the context. Yes, more about how it's used and how does that term, that piece of terminology, fits in the context of that field, of that setting.
Olga, you were mentioning before that pre-COVID there was some tours that you could attend called In Her Shoes, and it took you through the process of applying for an intervention order. In the absence of such live tours, we can make use of virtual tours or videos. You know, there's a lot of YouTube channels that are specific to the Australian context as well. For example, if we have a look at the YouTube channel of Courts Admin Authority in South Australia, there's a 20-minute video on what happens before, during, and after an intervention order, and the video is called Intervention Order Applications Stop the Violence.
That's excellent, Fatih. Exactly right. And we all know that sometimes we don't have the time. In particular, interpreters, we are always running from one place to another, pre-COVID, of course, when we're not in lockdown. And we might not have the time just to go for one of these tours or to just to visit the courts, which we can at any time. But of course, we have it at our fingertips. That's a great resource there, Fatih. If you can share that with.
I'm just going to put that in the chat box for everyone else as well.
Oh, wonderful. But there are so many videos and resources. We just have to take a bit of time and go onto Google and, of course, accessing good resources, okay, such as the court system and the available organisations that we have here in Australia, okay. All right. Okay, now we're going to have a look at a couple of settings as an example so that you can then prepare for other settings, okay? Now, how police officers conduct themselves during an interview will often determine the level of cooperation with the officer will receive from the victim. And the interview can also influence the victim's willingness to cooperate during the prosecution, if any, at a later stage. All right. So the answers will help put in place systems to protect the victim and her children. And police need specific answers and specific information in order to then be able to present it before the court. Yes, for example, so police need evidence. That's one of the aims, yes, of the questions that they're going to ask. They need evidence to be able to put in place systems to protect and to take before a court. So when interviewing a victim, some of the kinds of questions that police officers might ask have to be specific and direct and ask in a supportive and matter-of-fact tone of voice. So some examples of questions to ask that they ask victims of domestic violence might be, can you tell me what happened? Okay. Or they might say, you have an injury. It seems like someone has hit you. Who hit you? Okay. Has this person ever hit you before? We might already be thinking, okay, it's not the same to, have committed this violence a number of times than one time for evidence. Okay. What did the person hit you with? Was it with an open or was it with a closed hand? Where on your body were you hit? Point to it. Okay, point to that part. How many times were you hit? Was there any instruments used? Did the person hit you with a shoe? Did they use a knife? Did they use a gun, a telephone, the hand, a fist? Were any threats made against you? And of course, are there any weapons in the house? Okay, so those are some of the questions that that might be used by police in this setting. Of course, it would be great to complement this with any PD on police interviewing. I'm sure that Fatih, if hasn't organised that yet, that will be organising it soon. Is that right, Fatih?
That's correct. There is a webinar coming up in regards to interpreting in police interviews, and that will be presented by Dr. Miranda Lai, and that's upcoming before the new year.
Yes, that's excellent, because then you will see there with Miranda that will complement greatly. She probably will be talking about discourse and police interviewing. What type of discourse markers and how do they ask those questions? So it's great that if you can do that professional development, that would be excellent.
Now, sorry, Olga, just on that, it will be on the 25th of November, 2020. So just coming up in 1 month's time, or month after next. So not in October, the month after, 25th of November. It's called Ethics for Police Translators and Interpreters. And that will be presented by Dr. Miranda Lai, and you can access that through our Conversations training website.
Well, that's excellent. As we know, domestic violence or discussions or domestic violence jobs will happen in a wide range of settings. So then having specific specialized training in those specific settings is also a great complement to this. So yes, very good, very good. All right, now some kinds of questions that that police officers shouldn't be asking and won't be asking are questions which appear to blame the victim or which are asked in a hostile tone of voice, because they may have the effect of further intimidating the victim or obscuring, and they'll be missing important evidence. Therefore, officers should not ask accusing or hostile questions. For example, what did you do to make this person hit you? Or what did you say? Okay. Also, questions that are ambiguous or rhetorical. For example, are you okay? So those are questions not to be asked. Are you okay? Because we have to keep in mind that when most people are asked, are you okay? They automatically answer, I'm fine. The person might not be fine at all. And often the victim is in shock and may not be fully aware of their injuries. Okay, so in order to find out the person's actual condition, they ask very specific questions which will focus the victim's attention to her injuries and the extent of those injuries. So police know that earning the victim's confidence and cooperation will rely on actually the questions or the kinds of questions asked and the way they are asked. Okay. So our job is not only to transfer the meaning, yes, but also the intent. Okay, that's in our code of ethics as well. So in other words, not only the what, but also the how. Okay, and we'll understand to do this better if we know the why, so the purpose. Okay. All right, we've got another example here of a setting. And this is a pregnancy care appointment or setting. And these are the questions used in assessment of family violence. So screening for domestic violence happens or is in place in a range or in a number of services, and this is one of them, because as you remember last session, we talked about when women are most at risk, and one of them was when they are pregnant. The other one is when they leave the relationship. Okay, so one of them is when they are pregnant. So some of the questions used in assessment of family violence in these settings are, within the last year, have you ever been hit or hurt or slapped in or hurt in any way by your partner or ex-partner? Or has your partner or someone in your family or household ever pushed you or hit you or kicked you or otherwise hurt you? They'll also ask, are you ever afraid of your partner or ex-partner or someone in your family? Or has someone in your family or your partner put you down, have humiliated you, or tried to control what you can and cannot do? Remember that they are quite descriptive, the questions, because you see sometimes behaviors have been normalized. Doesn't mean that they are normal. They have just been normalized. So those violent behaviors sometimes are, we don't, or the victim might not realize that they are actually domestic that are not okay and that they are violent behaviors. So if these professionals ask, are you a victim of family violence? They may in fact be, but they might say no, because those behaviors might be normalized in her context, and so would not know. So that's why these questions are very specific and very descriptive. They'll also ask, would you like help from us now? And they'll ask, is it safe for you to go home now when you leave this appointment? Okay, so questions such as I said before, are you a victim straight, or how are things going at home, are not very useful. Okay. And as interpreters, we need to be aware of how questions are made and how we interpret these in the target language. We know that language is not maths. Yes, interpreting, translating is not maths. It's not 2 + 2 is 4. It might be something different. So we have to be aware of how they are asked, so that when we transfer, we don't ask them in a different way. Okay. Also, it's important to know that professionals may ask confirming questions. For example, so just restating what the client has said in order to check that they have understood what they're saying. And also to validate what the client has said. That's important. Validating is also important in these settings. So it's crucial that we don't think that it's just a repetition and that we can admit it. Oh, I already asked this and the client said yes, so I'll just say yes. It's important that we know that they are asked again, or that they are restating what the client has said, and that is for a purpose. Okay. There's also barriers to screening, and these might be, first of all, the presence of the woman's partner. Of course, it's a pregnancy environment, so it might be that the partner is present. So that's a barrier to screening. Women's also unwillingness to disclose. This might be for a range of reasons, okay? Also because of cultural taboos. And concerns also about privacy and confidentiality. So that's when that has implications for us as well. Okay, so making sure that we know how to transfer that, building rapport of the professional with the client, so that the woman is willing to disclose and feels comfortable enough to disclose, and also that that we don't add to concerns of privacy and confidentiality, so that we actually talk about our adherence and our observation of confidentiality. Okay. So the steps that these professionals take are to listen, to believe, to ask about the needs of the client, to validate their experiences, and they will do this, as I said, by restating what they've said, and by enhancing safety and also offering ongoing support. Okay. Now, talking about rapport building, in terms of disclosing violence, discussions of domestic violence requires rapport between the health professional and the woman. And women experience abuse. Women who experience abuse may not speak up when the subject is first raised, but they might choose to open up later when they feel sufficient trust and confidence in the health professional. This might be at a possibly at a later appointment with the same person. And it's important for health professionals to ask about domestic violence in private and in a sensitive manner, and provide a response that takes into consideration the complexities of women's needs. So we as interpreters play a big role here in assisting to build that rapport by providing quality interpreting. Okay, this doesn't mean that we provide individual rapport with them. We transfer linguistically that rapport building. Okay, and we do that by transferring the meaning, but also the intent, and knowing about how they do it, how they build rapport. Okay. Now, some of the key considerations that these health professionals will have in discussing and responding to family violence is that they'll explain that the women's responses will be kept confidential, subject to legal requirements, of course. So we need also to do the same for both parties. Okay, there's always going to be a moment where the professional is going to talk about confidentiality. In some settings, as you know, they'll even have a document where the client will sign and they will sign. So that's the perfect opportunity for us. If we haven't had the opportunity at the beginning of the session, we all know the challenges that we experience when we get into appointments, when they're a bit of a rush, we all know that. But there's always a little window where we can do this, and that is explaining that about confidentiality, the interpreter's confidentiality, and we do that, of course, in both directions. And also because, as you know, we always have to have our notepad and our pen ready, because we don't know if we are in a DV, in a domestic violence or domestic violence discussion. It might be the case where we won't be able to cut in, where we won't be able to, or the client might not be making much sense, because that's what happens when we are disclosing trauma. So we'll have our notepad and our pen. Make sure that when you are talking about confidentiality that you mention that, okay, because they don't know. They are very concerned about their privacy and about being safe. So it's a good idea to tell them, I might take notes in order to assist me with interpreting. And if I do so, I will then at the end give the notes to the professional, or I will destroy them in front of you, or something like that. Okay, so that's very important. That is going to assist build the rapport between the professional and the client, and it's not only going to assist in building rapport, it's just our job to do it. Okay. They have in mind encouragement and sensitivity. So building of a trusting therapeutic relationship is essential to facilitate this disclosure. Okay. Cultural sensitivity. And equally important, non-judgmental. So, and that is the aim of their work. That is how they will conduct their work. So it's all this is crucial information that we need in order to provide quality interpreting services. So we know that interpreting is not only about language, it's about a whole range of expert skills, including discourse considerations and deep contextual knowledge. So discourse consideration is about the context, is about how they ask questions, it's about knowing the purpose, it's about knowing why they ask those questions, the aim, what they do. Okay, and deep contextual knowledge. What is this field about? Otherwise, that model of professionalism that we discussed in part 1 webinar will not hold. yes, and we won't be able to provide quality professional interpreting services. Okay, if you don't remember, go back to your notes or go back to part 1 and have a look at the model of professionalism by Erica Gonzalez, okay, and how we need to have all those pillars, all those columns in order to then provide quality interpreting.
Olga, just one question there. I've got a couple, but one I think I can ask now. What if the domestic violence is verbal, like swearing or demeaning or threatening? What would the victim respond to the police when they ask for evidence?
What will the police ask? Sorry? No, what will they respond?
How would the victim respond to the police when the police ask for evidence of swearing and demeaning or threatening? I guess because there's nothing physical.
Physical, yes, of course. Now, those were just some examples of questions. They will be asking similar, in a similar way, very specific questions for that. Now, in terms of evidence, I'm not a legal expert, of course, but I know that many times even having a journal, a diary from victims can serve as evidence in court. Okay, so of situations, or on this day they told me this and that. They, you know, it's different types, psychological and emotional abuse. Okay. So those were just examples of some of the questions that they, of course, those were more related to physical violence, but they will ask very particular questions as well. They need very detailed information in order to use as evidence.
I've got another couple more, but I'm going to leave them for a little bit later because they're a little bit more general. Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right. We've got here another example, and this is in relation to domestic violence response workers, like social workers and case workers, intake workers. Some of these are from organizations that you might have heard about or you have interpreted at, like Women's Health West or In Touch. Okay, so when someone discloses sexual or domestic violence, the response of the professional is critical to their recovery and the decisions that they will make about what to do next. Okay, and there are 3 key things that they that these domestic violence workers say, and that is that I am sorry for what has happened to you, because when they say that, the client hears, I believe you. They also say what happened to you is a crime, and what the client will hear will be, this is not my fault. Yes. And they also say something very critical, and that is, what I will do what I can to help you. And that is because the client then hears, you are not alone. Okay. Sometimes or many times domestic violence victims feel that they won't be believed. Okay, so these are important things that they will say to their clients. Now, some of the initial responses of domestic violence workers are what they do and what they don't do. We've got here on the slide. Things that they do, or examples of things that they do, is that they listen to the story. Okay, now in comparison to police, sometimes police need very quick information, very detailed, so they can do something about it very quickly. Now, this is in a different setting. They might have more time, okay? The worker doesn't need immediate detailed information at that point, or very specific information in order to take it before the court system, yes? They will need for then developing a safety plan. But at this time, they listen to the story and they let them express how they feel, however that might look like, or however that might be. They let them cry if they need to. They encourage them. and they don't worry if parts of the story don't add up, okay? This will have implications for us as note-taking skills, okay, and chuchotage if appropriate. We know that sometimes chuchotage might not be appropriate because some clients might not work for them, but it might be that we have to switch onto chuchotage. Okay, so parts of the story might not add up. That's just what happens when trauma is being disclosed. They'll tell them that they are sorry for what has happened to them, and they will explain what they can do for them at that point. Okay, what they don't do is tell them what to do. That will take agency away from women. They have been told what to do, they've been controlled, okay, for a long time, so they won't tell them what to do, and they won't try to take over. And of course, they won't ask why questions, because why questions are blame questions, yes? And they won't get angry on their behalf. Victims have and survivors have enough already to deal with without worrying about someone else getting angry on their behalf. And they don't assume how they feel. And that is because everyone experiences trauma differently. Okay, so we see here the implications for our work. For example, making use of our discourse management skills. In other words, knowing when to cut in and how to cut in, not in the middle of a thought. Okay, that might then make the client shut down, not in the middle of the thought, and not just saying stop or don't talk now. Not that. That is just bringing that controlling, bringing that that power into the setting, okay, from the violent situation into the setting, into that appointment. So we need to do this in a sensitive way. Okay, we also need to make sure that our note-taking skills are up to date, and making sure that we are not using why during our language transfer. Okay, yes.
Olga, I've got a comment regarding this. I don't have a question, but I would like to thank you for your advice regarding taking notes in such situations. On one occasion, I was interpreting during a counseling session, and the professional asked me not to take notes, even though I said that I will destroy them in front of them. It was difficult to interpret as the client was speaking without pausing and proving a lot disconnected information.
Yes, indeed. One of the things that we discussed in our part 1 webinar was the lack of understanding and knowledge that professionals have of our work and what our needs. Yes. One of the things that, so we will come across challenges like this one, not only that one, where they would say, no, don't take notes. They don't trust, they might not trust us, they might not have an understanding of what is our work, of our professional expertise. Another thing that might happen is when they tell you, no, they're just when you ask for a bit of information in the briefing just to assist your interpreting. So what is going to happen today? And they will say, oh, that you're just the interpreter, you don't need to know. That's because they don't understand. They don't have an understanding of, many of them do. It is, but they do. But many of them don't. And it seems like a conversation between professionals and the interpreting field needs to happen so that they know, so the different settings and the interpreting field, so that they know what are the needs for interpreters in order to provide quality interpreting, because that's going to affect, if they don't let you take notes, you're not a machine. You won't be able to be accurate. You won't be able to render complete or to transfer complete renditions. So it's just going to affect everyone. It's going to affect the outcome of that appointment and that assignment and that communicative event. So it might be a good idea at the beginning, if we have the possibility, I know that it's not always possible, if we have always demand to have a briefing, just demand it, I need a briefing, and maybe in those couple of minutes explain why note-taking is so important and that we need to be ready. Sometimes we know that we don't need it because it's an easy dialogue, but we always have to be ready. Okay, I'm sorry that happened to you. I know it's very challenging for us many times, but we do need to speak up and demand what are our needs in order to provide quality interpreting.
Thank you very much, Olga, for that. You're definitely right. I mean, we also do have the right to request certain things, and in order for us to deliver our interpreting services to the best of our abilities, that is going to provide the most optimum outcome for everyone involved, because at the end of the day, the goal is there for the goal is for everyone to achieve the same goal. I mean, we're all working towards the same thing there. So I think it's very important that in this case, for example, the professional comes on board as well. And sometimes it's just a matter of educating the service provider in regards to how an interpreter works and why note-taking is needed. Just like you said, it's very important. You were mentioning chuchotage, as some of our interpreters might not be familiar with the term chuchotage. So chuchotage is what we refer to as simultaneous interpreting in the community setting. It's a French word meaning whisper, but we don't actually whisper it. It's interpretation done with a soft voice, and it's basically simultaneous interpreting done without the use of microphones and headphones. So that's what Olga was referring to as chuchotage. It could be sometimes that simultaneous interpreting would be suitable, but it could be off-putting for the clients, either the professional or the non-English speaking clients. So you might need to divert to note-taking, because a dialogue can sometimes turn into a monologue in such situations.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Fatih, for clarifying. Yes, chuchotage is just another term. Talking of terminology, just another term for simultaneous interpreting. And I imagine that all interpreters here have went through the chuchotage professional development courses that were delivered in order to certify, or not?
It was a requirement for transitioning, so there should be, most of them should have had the training. Yep. But there will be some skills training coming up as well. As part of the All Graduates Training Division conversations, there'll be some skills webinars and courses coming up. So if you either need a little bit of a brush up on your skills, or you'd like to learn some new skills, they're also on the way.
That's great. That's great. Okay, now, as you see here, again, if you can't see it clearly, don't worry, you've got a link to that as well. The last example here is in relation to counselling work. Using interpreters obviously adds a complexity to counselling. However, if a client does not understand the counsellor, well, then counselling is impossible, yes? So therefore, the work of interpreters is essential. So we become this window into change that they refer to here. So the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Clearinghouse, they refer to us as a window into change. So as you may know, counselling or casework often involves a wider scope of support work, as well as therapy, of course. So clients who are new to Australia often need guidance linking into irrelevant support systems. For example, it can be impossible for a client to focus on their own mental health while they are having difficulty finding a house, yes, or securing housing. So the support work may include formulating, providing, and negotiating referrals as well. So as you can see, we might be at a counselling or casework assignment where discussions of other services might overlap. Which is quite common in the field of domestic violence, given the range of response services and the range of effects and impacts of domestic violence. All right, I'm just conscious of the time. Now, another thing that we mentioned earlier is knowing about the documents used in different settings. And as an example, we're going to have a look at two of these that are commonly used. You might have come across them or maybe not. And this is the power and control wheel. Now, professionals use these wheels to help teach clients about the dynamics of an abusive relationship. It shows victims that they are not alone in what they are experiencing and that these tactics of maintaining power and control are common to abusers. They're not just a one-off thing. They also use the wheel to help other clients to better understand the complicated components of abuse and the many forms that it can take. So it can really be helpful in explaining the difficulties and dangers of leaving an abusive relationship. Okay, many organizations and professionals use this power and control wheel. So women can actually point at each of the tactics on the wheel and clearly explain how these behaviors were used against them. So you might be sight translating. They might have this document on the table, and you might have to sight translate or interpret what the professional is reading. And the women might be pointing at some of these examples of abuse, of behaviors. So they will be able to see that they are not alone in their experience, and they will be and more fully understand how their perpetrator could exert such control over them. So the wheel in general makes the pattern, the intent, and impact of violence in a visible way. So being familiar with this material is going to assist us in our interpreting greatly with, and it's going to assist with accuracy, and it's going to assist with completeness. Okay, knowing about it. This is another one. This is the post-separation power and control wheel. I think, Fatih, you mentioned, you gave it a different title before, but I think it's because that's the name that appears on the link, but it's actually the post-separation power and control wheel. In any case,
I've got one here.
Yeah.
Power and control, and the other one says using children wheel.
Yes, I think it's just because they've put that name on the link, but it's not. It's the post-separation power and control wheel. However, if you have a look in this website, there are a whole range of wheels in relation to domestic violence, and they have translated them in a few languages. So you might, if your language is there, it might be useful. Okay. Now, this is a similar document that is likely to be used after women have escaped violence. So it's a post-separation from the perpetrator. Okay, I think it's a good idea to have a look at it. Firstly, because you might have to sight translate it, of course, during a job or maybe a similar one. And second, because it shows us how violence doesn't just end after separation. So remember when we talked about how women are at high risk when they leave the violent relationship? So this describes what may be happening for women who have escaped violence. It also destroys that myth of women can leave the relationship whenever they like. Okay, that's just a myth. Or questions such as, why doesn't she just leave? Why doesn't she leave if she's been abused? Okay, so remember that women develop strategies to keep themselves and their children safe. And sometimes leaving is not the safest at that particular point in time. Okay, there needs to be a safety plan in place. Okay. And to finish off, I have set an activity for you to do in your own time, which I think will be helpful, and you can use it as an activity, as an exercise that you might do in a regular way for your work. So in the next slide, and you also have it in the handout, there are a few scenarios that you might have in mind, and you pick one. Or what you can also do to do this exercise is do it in relation to a scenario, to a job that you have had, okay, where you might have come across challenges. So you think about the challenges that you might come across in one of these scenarios as an interpreter. You might think about the actions or the ways of working that may be unhelpful to the aims of that communicative session. Okay, and also think about what would actually assist better towards the aims of the communicative event, of the interpreted session. Think about, and this is very important, and this is what we were talking about just before, the needs of women, so the needs of the client, the professional, and yourself as an interpreter. What are the needs in order to better meet them for all of them? Okay, so in order to meet the goals, to meet the aims of that session, in order for you as an interpreter, what are the needs? What do you need to provide quality interpreting? And don't just think about it and say, well, this might be the challenge, or this is what I would do, or this is best, or try to justify your reflections and your choices. So, for example, we don't say, because our code of ethics says that I need to be impartial, or that I just can't give advice, or that I need to be confidential. Try to reflect and to justify why is the reason, and how does confidentiality, how might it look like? How are you actively going to observe confidentiality? That's just an example. So the issues might represent or might be related to ethics, to the role of the interpreter, to issues with terminology, maybe with the lack of contextual knowledge, or lack of knowledge of what domestic violence is. It might be in relation to interpreting skills and so on. You have in the handout the scenarios. Okay, I'll just mention one. Here it says court interpreting. The interpreter is required to interpret for both the women and the perpetrator, the victim and the perpetrator. Okay, we know that the Royal Commission into Family Violence, one of the recommendations is that there has to be one interpreter for each party. Yes, I am not 100% sure that that happens all the time now, and that recommendation has been implemented 100%. Sometimes it's just because of availability. There might just not be an interpreter or two interpreters. And it not always happens in court interpreting, does it? It can happen in other settings where there's just one interpreter booked for both. So think about, of course, this is out of our control. This is not my responsibility, but what are the things that we can do to manage this challenge? Okay. I'll leave these scenarios and this activity for you to have a look. And I know that you've got the references and you have all the material that you need. I'm just conscious of the time. It's already 6:30. So thank you very much. Fatih, off to you.
Thank you. Olga, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for attending and sending all your questions and comments through. We do really appreciate it. Now, I wasn't able to direct all the questions to Olga, but we will definitely compile the questions and then email them back to you in an FAQ format. Okay, so sooner or later you will definitely get answers to your questions. I do promise you that. Again, thank you so much for attending. Those of you who did not attend part 1 of domestic violence in interpreting settings, you can access the recording from our website. You can purchase it from the All Graduates Conversations Training website. And there is also, as we know, as I told you, there's a couple more webinars coming that could be also related to domestic violence interpreting, like interpreting in police interviews, as well as vicarious trauma for interpreters. I think, Olga, what do you think? Would that be something that you recommend in regards to matching it up with this webinar as well?
Absolutely. I could recommend vicarious trauma, police interpreting, interviewing, counseling, mental health. I mean, so many other settings that can be related to overlap with domestic violence. So all of them would be very helpful indeed.
And thank you again so much, Olga. You will get a link tomorrow with access to the recording of today's webinar for easy access and future reference. You have the handout, so make sure you download them. You have all the references that and the resources that Olga used today, as well as those wheels that you saw there for site translation practice. And finally, you've got the case scenarios there, so hopefully you'll take the time to have a go at those activities. And thank you again so much, Olga, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. And thank you again all out there, and stay safe.